Just wanted to introduce our keynote speaker. We're really lucky to have Dr. Cassie Yackley with us. She's from right here in New Hampshire, and she's one of the state's leaders in trauma-informed systems implementation. So she works with schools across the state to develop trauma-sensitive school communities, helping educators to understand and effectively manage challenging student behaviors. And in addition to her experience with schools, she also has over 20 years of experience as a community-based psychologist working with underserved populations. So we're happy to have her here. Dr. Yackley.
X-Files. Yeah. Thank you all very much. Not only do I have far too much to talk about in 45 minutes, folks who know me know that is nearly impossible for me to do, and then I had a technology delay, so I'll try to talk rapidly. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. Diana is amazing and has been working with me around this presentation. I am so excited that we're focused on student social emotional learning at this point in time. And I want to say, I was thinking, why did I end up spending most of my life around traumatized youth and families? And I think it's because spending more than 20 years doing mental health treatment, you learn very quickly that the vast majority of folks that you're working with come from traumatized backgrounds and circumstances. So it makes sense that that is our focus now. The second part I'm excited about talking to you about today is that my real passion in life is interpersonal neurobiology or social neuroscience, and really taking what we've learned through the research over the last 20 years about our brain and how we turn brains on to learning and how we heal trauma, and how much of that foundation really underlies social and emotional learning. So my goals for today are to talk a little bit briefly about some of what I see are the educational challenges faced by educators broadly, but certainly by teachers in the classroom day to day that I spend a lot of time working with and consulting to. We'll spend a moment about what is social emotional learning and how has that been defined by others very briefly, but then we really want to dig into the roots, what underlies the capacity for the 5 main characteristics that are identified with regard to the components of SEL. And then last but not least, I'd like to share some information. Louis Cozzolino talks a lot about our educational paradigm, where we've been, what we know about brain science, and where in the world do we go from here to support students and teachers. So I'd like to talk a little bit and provoke some thought about where we might be headed in terms of supporting our teaching staff to meet these challenges. So I'm going to talk about 4 primary challenges that I see in terms of the educational situation. And obviously, most of this has to do with traumatic exposure and violence, given what we know now. And I'll talk very briefly today about prevalence and why in the world this is the focus of understanding challenging behavior. So again, my message is really a message of hope and brain change and seeing what we're able to effectively do to help students learn through relationships. But I do think it's important to point out that we are bathed in a society of violence at this point, certainly in terms of the students that we're seeing in the classroom. You can look at the reports now of violent incidents in school. And you can see from what we see here that about 65% of public schools report at least one violent incident having occurred during the previous academic school year. And then in 13% of those schools, a serious, so a threat with a weapon or significant risk to bodily harm in terms of an incident. And then furthermore, you can see that there are also physical threat. So lack of safety, worry about threat, and then violence in the actual school setting. I'll be honest, that pales in comparison to what we see in U.S. homes today. Oops. I spent the last 3 years working across the state training all of the Department of Children, Youth and Families, Child Protection, and Juvenile Justice to do trauma-informed care because we know what the prevalence of child maltreatment is in our society, in our state, in our world today. I don't need to read all of these quotes to you, but we know that there are about 1 million cases of child abuse substantiated each year, and we all know that substantiating a case of child abuse is not an easy thing to do, certainly in our state of New Hampshire, but I know other states have similar challenges with regard to statutes. I always remind people I love working with young children. I train clinicians across the state in child-parent psychotherapy and evidence-based practice for 0 to 6 exposure to violence. So I want to remind us all, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir, that the most vulnerable, those at the most risk, are young children. About 1/4 of the victims are children under 6 years of age, and children under 1 actually represent the highest risk of maltreatment across all age groups. And this is before we saw the opiate crisis and what that's going to look like over the next couple of years in terms of our numbers. Can I see a show of hands for folks who know the ACEs study? Fabulous. I would say 5 years ago, I would ask in a room if people knew what the ACEs study was, and most people would not raise their hands. I am delighted that we all know what ACEs is. I feel like it's brought to the public forefront what we've all known for a very long time about the children in our classroom, and frankly, the caregivers that we're working with, that a large proportion of them had had some kind of exposure to adverse experiences. I'm going to try to sum ACEs up in about 1.5 minutes. Let's see how I do. If I miss any important pieces, then you guys out there keep me honest and certainly go ahead and add what those are. But what I see is really critical about the ACEs study. This was a study done of about 17,000 individuals initially. It was done in San Diego. They were Kaiser Permanente insurance-carrying individuals, so average population, if you will. The researchers, Folletti and Anda in this case, were trying to figure out obesity and why people kept bouncing back from obesity success. So really came upon it coincidentally and not as part of their initial research aim. They did 3 things in the study. They asked folks whether they had 10 adverse childhood experiences, and those experiences have a broad range from parental divorce all the way up to parental incarceration, child maltreatment, parental substance abuse, death of a parent, etc. Then they looked at what are their risk-taking behaviors as reported, and we're primarily talking about sexualized behaviors and substance use behaviors in terms of those risk behaviors. And then last but not least, they look at the physical health of those individuals, both at that time and longitudinally over time. What you see up on the screen right here now is the famous ACEs pyramid, which represents the progress or the lack of progress that happens as a result of childhood adverse experiences. So what we learned from the ACEs, number 1, is that about 71% of the general population report having experienced at least one adverse childhood experience. And again, these are insurance-carrying folks. I will say to you that, as most of you know, this research has been replicated many, many times, and the numbers remain consistent in terms of the findings. So obviously, as the pyramid is indicating, when we have challenging, adverse things happen to us when we're little and our brain is occupied, the conversation of our topic today, then we have disruptions in terms of neurodevelopment that put us at risk later on for our success in functioning, and then certain health risk behaviors, and ultimately accounts for the vast majority of statistical variance of whether you will end up dying from one of the 5 major health killers in the United States: diabetes, heart disease, cancer, etc. So I think it's important because it has all of our eyes on this understanding about how prevalent just in our general world trauma is, how compromising trauma is, not only to neurodevelopment, but ultimately to our health and well-being as adults and our ultimate longevity. Did I miss anything I should have said about ACEs in that brief synopsis? Okay, great. So I would ask you to think for yourselves, how many of you personally have witnessed a violent act in the last year? How many have personally witnessed a violent act in the last... I see a show of hands. That's not happened before. So not only do we face and see violence in our own lives, but if we turn on the television, we are also bathed in a culture of violence, something Bruce Perry refers to as the vortex of violence. Early maltreatment experiences, then later replicated through power dynamics that we view on television, where ultimately the aim is to have power through violence. So prior to age 18, kids in the US view more than 200,000 acts of violence, and more than 16,000 of those acts are murders. For each hour of television, there are about 812 violent acts, and children's shows include up to 20 violent acts hourly, mainly in cartoons. So then there's the disconnect in our world, right? We are increasingly more and more disconnected, connected by social forms of media that don't lend themselves necessarily to the kind of intimate relationships that forge healthy brains. I see kids and adults and people in the world as starving for attention at this point in time, given the lack of connectedness and the amount of work we're all putting into our lives. I'm a mental health provider. I provided therapy for over 20 years. I would love to believe that therapists are going to cure our issues with mental illness and with trauma, and therapy is not enough. When we know what we know about the brain and what we're going to talk about today in terms of how to change brains and turn on neuroplasticity, then we know that there have to be lots of powerful relationships and interactions, and not just that therapy hour once a week. I like to talk a lot about human contagion effect of human relationships. We're going to talk today about attunement and attachment very briefly, and about one of my favorite things, mirror neurons, and what they lead us to do, and that is to resonate with the feelings and the emotions of those with us. And so we begin to think about what kind of human relationships do we have around students, do we have personally, and what is the effect emotionally of contact in that kind of relational context. A lot of folks are talking about unexpressed relationship capabilities that we see so many students, and I would make the case so many educators at this point in time with lack of opportunity to develop relationship skills, and certainly relationship skills based on what we know now about how to build effective and brain-changing relationships. I didn't know if I'd have time for this example of disconnection, but I just find this really fascinating. If you look at those veterans who served during Afghanistan in the summer of 2009, and you compare that to those folks that had returned home, more people died at home of suicide or homicide than those who died in active duty. We think about what we do in terms of connectedness, not just, I would say, people being exposed to that kind of trauma, but I think the loss of the kind of connected network that service is able to provide for those individuals, and then the disconnect that they experience in their relationships as they return. So we know a lot now about this fundamental need for connection. Many folks are talking now about increasing demands for teachers. I certainly don't need to tell you all that those demands are increasing. My hats are off. I have such admiration for the folks that are in the classroom day to day dealing with the challenges that they face. And what I've tried to do is just outline what I think are a few of the things that teachers are having to struggle with these days in terms of effective teaching. We have larger and larger class sizes, despite the research that indicates very clearly that the ratio of student to teacher makes a tremendous difference in terms of student outcomes and success. In some ways, we're trying to compete with technology and figure out how we can be more exciting than the latest video game, iPhone, Facebook, whatever that technology piece is. We've got students faced with bullying and now cyberbullying that we have even less control and understanding about than traditional bullying. There's increased accountability for student outcomes. Somebody said once to me, I read recently something about trauma-informed care, and that trauma-informed care is about providing the optimal opportunity for somebody to be successful, not being tied to an individual outcome. And I know that's hard to say when we all focus and think very hard about data-driven work and outcomes, so it's something to certainly wrap our mind around. We either have over or under-involved parents. That seems to resonate when I talk to teachers. You kind of get one end or the other end. Salaries, I think salaries of teachers should be that professional sports players make, so Cassie for president. Childhood obesity, we all know what the implications are of obesity and what that means for our capacity to attend, to maintain, and to use our brain. Poverty, the increasing number of children in poverty, and then the difference in students. The difference in students' attitudes and behaviors and motivation, I would say broadly. I'm pouring through a research paper right now called Motivation Matters. Absolutely fascinating. I was going to talk to you about it today, but I would never have time. One of my other favorite topics is the science of hope and understanding why hope is so darn important in terms of what we're figuring out about resiliency factors today. But I think of a lot of what we're asking folks to do, and what I hope my talk is about today is encouraging us to hold hope that we're going to translate what we know about the exciting brain sciences into the way that looks in teacher classroom instruction and relationships. We also know this, we're faced with a lot of complex trauma. Complex trauma is not PTSD, a single car accident where somebody has a trigger response, right? It is profuse, profound delays and challenges that are messy and look like a whole bunch of other things. ODD, ADHD, attachment disorder, all of those other things that we're dealing with. When we know what we know about the effects of human contagion, then we also know that if we're around complex trauma most of our time, then we're also being impacted by the fact that we are around others that have been traumatized and are harboring feelings of helplessness and hopelessness. And if we continue to have these kinds of challenges without providing teachers the kinds of skills and opportunities to feel effective in relationships with traumatized students, then I worry that we risk burnout faster than we need to. When we have these kinds of exposures, you can see, as I've indicated here, they lead to feelings of helplessness and hopelessness, shame, core shame, the feeling I'm not worthy or I'm not good enough to do what I need to do, and then blame. Wherever I go talking about trauma, somebody is blaming someone else. And in fact, I've said to lots of people when I was a mental health provider, I used to say a lot, if DCYF or Child Protective Services would just do their job, then I'd be just fine. And then I went to work for DCYF. Actually, I worked for Dartmouth, but I consulted to DCYF for several years, and you know what they were saying? If mental health professionals would just do their job. And then I go to schools, and they're kind of blaming one or the other, right? So I just want us to think about these notions that tend to surround complex trauma, and I want you all to begin thinking about what they may mean for the way we're educating students and preparing teachers these days. So I have a fun little clip I'd like to share with you that I think represents well what this experience may be, and hopefully technology is going to be, fully cooperative today. I don't know how loud it's going to be. Sometimes it's good to smile a little too. And I think it has real relevance for where we feel sometimes today in terms of what we're facing in the classroom, stuck with the alternatives that we have and waiting for someone to come by with the magic answer to all of that. And I often start by saying to audiences, and I didn't today, that most of the time what people want me to do is they want me to come and give a toolbox of techniques to fix complex trauma, right? If you will just tell me the 10 strategies that will fix complex trauma, Cass, it will be great. And I spent years feeling really guilty about not having that toolbox, and then I realized it was very freeing just to be honest with people and say that I don't know that there's a tiny toolbox or a big toolbox of techniques that will cure complex trauma or what we're facing in terms of challenging students. However, I am ultimately 100% convinced that what we know about relationships, what we know about brain change, will change the way we educate students. So it's both of those. I'm going to transition a little bit here now to looking at social and emotional learning. And I've adopted, or I'm choosing to share with you for the purposes of today, the core competencies established by CASEL, which include self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. These should be familiar to most of you in the room, I assume. What I've tried to do, and hopefully this will come out as fancy to you as it was in my own mind, but I think it is just magnificent. If you really begin to look at those core competencies, they are all rooted in interpersonal neurobiology mechanisms that we know about. So what I'm going to try to do for you next is to demonstrate, looking at each of those, how those are foundationally built through those initial attachment and attunement relationships. So bear with me. So I always have to do this part. We have to catch up with the brain sciences, because what I'm going to talk about is going to be built on a foundation of basic neurobiology. And so I'm going to do this super quick, and if it doesn't make sense, then somebody throw something at me or raise your hand and let me know to pause. But I'm always surprised these days. I think audiences have a really nice foundation of brain understanding, so I try to do it quickly just to make sure that we all feel like we're on the same page. And I just couldn't get rid of all the slides, Diana. I couldn't do it. So I also want us to think about this idea that we're looking at a historical perspective for the way brains developed. And I think for a long time, we talked about the reptilian brain and how the fear brain developed out of those initial instincts to survive, right? The way humans survived initially is that they were very quick and rapid at getting out of circumstances because they could detect fear rapidly. And when they detected fear rapidly, without a lot of thought into it, they activated through their brainstem to get themselves out of the circumstance. When we're a little baby and you're born, the only way you survive is by another human. So clearly, attachment processes would be another one of those mechanisms that would have to share these fundamental core structures and functions of our brain. Now, excitingly, most of the folks have now turned their attention to what happened for hundreds of thousands of years when we lived in tribal groups, and what that meant for our capacity to communicate non-verbally or implicitly, and about how we are most effective when we capitalize on those systems that make us want to feel like we're part of the group, belonging or part of the tribe. And then it brings us up to where we are today. And where we are today, I would propose, and many others would be an educational paradigm and system which doesn't necessarily take advantage of some of what we know about these two eras of learning for our brain. So as I mentioned before, in terms of interpersonal neurobiology, it's about survival, and it made sense. Those who survived effectively, the ones who got out, and infant survival was completely dependent upon then an attachment figure. And then I mentioned the generations of brain development through tribes. We all know that information travels in our brain via neurons. Neurons have cell bodies, right, and dendrites, and then an axon that connects to the other neuron through a synaptic synapse. We put those wonderful neurotransmitters between those, and those things like dopamine and serotonin are the things that drive our pleasure center and some motivational systems as well. Most people know that the brain develops, it is use dependent in terms of its structure and function, right? If you don't use it, you lose it. Those areas which we devote a lot of our experiences to or our learning to are the ones that develop most thoroughly. When we have a communication go from one neuron to another, that axon path is strengthened. The more times that happens, the thicker the myelinization is on the outside of that, and the more likely that message is to take that particular path in our brain, hence fear learning and attachment learning. You hear the phrase a lot in interpersonal neurobiology, neurons that fire together, wire together. For a long time, we were very focused on brain regions, and while those have a lot to offer us in terms of understanding humans, it really is about how our brain is connected, right? We want lots of connectivity. We want especially a lot of connectivity in our brain between the left side of our brain and the right side of our brain, because those connect our language center, our meaning-making center, with our emotions and sensations. Many people talk about 3 primary brain regions. I think now they're focusing on 4 primary brain regions, beginning at the brainstem that keeps us alive, everything that keeps us alive, heart rate, breathing, all of those things. Next would be our diencephalon, or our cerebellum. We're not going to get to delve into that much today, but there's a lot of activity right now around looking at our cerebellum and how it really drives our capacity to maintain attention. Then we talk about our limbic system, right? And that houses the amygdala, the fear center of the brain, but also the hippocampus, the part of our brain that school is all about, consolidating and translating memory experiences into long-term memory. It has an inverse relationship with the amygdala, so that if our amygdala is firing and we are stressed and we feel fearful, we are not laying down permanent long-term memories through our hippocampus. And then last but not least, where the money's at, the prefrontal cortex. We all want kids to learn from consequences, right? We want them to learn from experiences. We want them to feel motivated. We want them to understand human relationships. We want them to have empathy and feel remorse if they hurt someone. All require the prefrontal cortex. And if we spend the vast majority of our development, as traumatized children and families do, in our fear brain, in our lower brain, what happens is we have an incredibly sophisticated and adaptive fear system, and they are going to be definitely the most likely folks to get out of that feared situation. In fact, our brain scans for fear about every quarter second. However, it also doesn't spend a lot of time in the midbrain and prefrontal cortex connection, so those are the regions that are compromised. Most of us know about the fact that our brain has bilateral functions. I mentioned a few minutes ago that primarily the right brain is responsible for emotional understanding. The left side of our brain is the language meaning. Part of the way we calm ourselves about a situation is that we're able to put words to it. Dan Siegel talks a lot about name it to tame it, that we put words to an experience, and by doing that, we're able to calm ourselves down because we have some understanding of what that is. We'll come back around to that. Especially important in terms of school readiness is the idea of sensitive periods. We could spend a whole day talking about what we know now about how those different brain regions develop in what sequence and at what exact ages, and then what are the implications if there are traumatic exposures. And I would say, usually when I'm talking about traumatic exposures, it's intermixed with what I would say big T's. I was sexually abused, my mom was maltreated, whatever those are. But more importantly, they talk about ambient trauma, right? Chaos all the time. Poverty, chaos, oppression, with some trauma smattered in there. So the preschool years represent, as we all know, an incredibly heightened time of sensitivity to the brain, as well as 0 to 3 in terms of our attachment relationships. The brain has to be incredibly efficient. I'm going to talk about memory next, and this will be important to our understanding of why memory functions as it does. But suffice to say that we have to think about the fact that our brain is always doing multi-level processing. We spend a lot of time thinking about our interface of our external world and what's coming in and what that means for processing the kind of information, what you're seeing, what somebody's saying, all of those kinds of things. But at the same time, our body, even more so, is processing what they would call bottom-up stimulation, right? Emotions and sensations, some of those which have words associated in meaning, and some of those that do not. So it has to both function and then simultaneously be processing the information that's coming through, both from the internal and the external world. Some pathways are really close to each other, meaning it might only go from my prefrontal cortex right down to my amygdala. Other pathways that we have go all the way down to our gut. I'm going to try to mention a little bit later polyvagal theory, Porges' theory, and how that talks about the way our vagal nerve actually begins in our gut, connects it to our limbic system, and has these really significant GI and emotional implications. I mentioned before internal and external inputs already always happening, and let's just say plasticity is easier at the top. Plasticity is that idea that we can change the shape of the brain. We know that you can grow new neurons throughout the course of your life. That's neuroplasticity. But also this idea that we can begin to change the shape and function of our brain. And the way we do that is we have more iterations of a pathway than was there previously. So if my experience in relationships has been terrifying and unsafe, I have to have that number of interactions, or maybe more so that number of interactions, until the safe response in our brain is the neural pathway that is accessed just as easily. Does that make sense? Memory is fascinating with regard to trauma, but even in generally speaking. So memory, we also have to think about memory also as having both internal and external inputs. And I think, again, we focus a lot on what came to us in terms of our hippocampus and external input, but also our memory, and the large bulk of our memory really has to do with memories about internal input that we have. Again, emotions and sensations that we have. We learn a few ways. We certainly learn through repetition, right? We can learn rote math facts if we practice them again and again. But I learned probably only 6 months ago that we actually learn more effectively through what they call emotional tagging. And this will make sense to everybody if you just think intuitively. We remember things that have some emotional salience to us, right? That makes sense. It's much easier than something we're just trying to do from rote memory. When we have experiences, they get encoded into memories, and that's usually an expectancy for a firing of a neuron. But what I want us to focus on in this one is what a memory is about an expectation for what's going to happen in the future. I'm like looking at her with her time signs. Don't even hold those signs. And so a firing of a particular neural network, a social engagement neural network, for example, alters the probability that it will fire again in the future. So coming around to implicit memory versus explicit memory. Explicit memory is everything we purposely recall and can retrieve. It's what we learn in school. It's what I say today. It is all of those memories, right? In contrast with implicit memory is early memory prior to birth. It begins at about 8 months of age developing, where explicit memory doesn't develop until we're 2 to 3 years of age. Implicit memory is largely outside of our awareness, and that seems weird to think about, but what I want you to think about is it just means that those do not have a neuronal connection with our prefrontal cortex. Okay, there's just not a thought connection. There's neural connections, but not including the thinking prefrontal cortex of our body. They're body-centered, they're emotions, they're sensory motor, they're subjective. We have a better understanding thus far of explicit memory than we do implicit memory. However, people have heard me say this, and I have to say it because it's always an important thing for us to think about. If you think about your day-to-day life, the decisions you make on a day-to-day basis in your relationships, in your work, in your private life, all of those things, and you think about what percentage of your behavior is driven by implicit memory versus explicit memory, what would you say that percentage is? What percentage of your behavior day to day is solely based on implicit memory? What I hear? 80? That's kind of scary, isn't it? Anybody argue with them? What else did I hear? A lot. It is actually a terrifying number for you all. Just so everybody can be uneasy today, the amount of our behavior driven by implicit memory is between 95 and 99% of our daily behavior. I've said with other audiences, I joke, I think that mine's better now because I know this fact, but I know that that is certainly not true. I just want to say a couple quick things about memory and stress. When we have stressful experiences, and we can do this range, right? We can do from I feel really stressed today about my job all the way to big T trauma and the adverse childhood experiences we talked about. But when we have something that's particularly stressful, and the more stressful or terrifying it is, two things happen. Number one, we get in our lower part of our brain, our fear part of our brain, so our prefrontal cortex isn't engaged, which means we do not encode explicit memories. So when people say they don't remember, the truth is they do not remember explicitly what happened. However, we actually begin to encode implicit memories even stronger, which makes sense, right? Our implicit memory is supposed to keep us alive, and the implicit memory is saying to us, this is scary, this is bad, this feels horrible, never forget this. It would be grand if our explicit memory was online with that, and then we knew exactly what that was about, but what happens for folks is they're engaged in a situation, they get very strong, visceral emotions and sensations. However, we don't have any thoughts associated with them to help that to make sense. If we expose the hippocampus to cortisol over long periods of time, which is included in our stress response system, our hippocampus will actually atrophy. It will calcify over time. All right, the relational modulation of stress and resilience. It's all about relationships. So let's talk a little bit about the stress response system. The stress response system is actually modulated by what they call the social engagement network. Bonding, closeness, instinctual bonding, pulling together a caregiver and a child. Attachment processes, social communications, and our need for affiliations in a group format. Tribal experiences taught us if we stay in our group with our like people, then we're safe and it feels good. It makes sense. Think when you're with your crowd, when you're with your folks, how much more comfortable you'll feel than when you're not in those circumstances. It calms our brain. It has a calming effect. Our capacity to benefit from what they call the relational modulation of stress depends on our experiences. So if my caregiver, when I felt stressed or when I felt distressed, more importantly, felt safe and help me to co-regulate and calm down, then my experience with other people in interpersonal relationships are likely to have the same result, calm me down. If my experiences in life were subpar or even maltreating, or I observed some kind of maltreating behavior, then when I'm in an interpersonal relationship, not up here, right, not cognitively, but implicitly, the feeling that I have is more dysregulation rather than a regulatory experience. Self-regulation is built through experiences with caregivers that help us to calm down through attunement. So it works like this. We're a little tiny baby. We feel upset. We start to cry. Mommy might look at us and do something like this. Oh, usually we first mimic a face. Oh, you're sad. It's okay. So we recognize minor cues in a little baby, right? We share those back. That's how a child develops who they know they are, their self-concept, and then we help to calm them by having an experience with us that calms them down as well. That doesn't change throughout our lifetime. Most people hear of 3 responses to threat, right? What are they? Yeah, guess what? There are 4, and I'm a little bit mad that we haven't been telling people about all these years, so let me share with you what the 4 responses to threat are. Number 1, flock. Biologically, our first instinct, that can't be true. Oh. Our first instinct when we are threatened is to flock. Think about what you do when you're upset by someone. What do? You go to someone you care about. If that doesn't work, and these work in a hierarchy, then we do fight, then we do flee, and then we do freeze. And freeze is about helplessness, dissociation. There's nothing I can do to get myself out of the circumstance. Talk a little bit now about some of the underlying mechanisms behind the core competencies. You have the slide definitions with you, so I'm going to move into the social neuroscience part. The way we learn to identify our thoughts and experiences is that we have opportunities with reflection, and that begins with a caregiver reflecting back to us. You look sad today. I wonder if you're hungry today. We begin to have a thought associated with sensations that we have. And over time, the way we continue to do that is to have opportunities to focus on our reactions. Caregivers help to build this by attuning, as I mentioned before. But recognize that reflection is a cognitive process that has to use a prefrontal cortex. Now, I'm delighted that we're doing mindsets, we're talking about grit, we're thinking about optimism, but understand that those also involve a prefrontal cortex. And what we have to do first is we have to get students, kids, adults, caregivers regulated enough, safe enough under circumstances so that they can bring to bear their prefrontal cortex and capitalize on the fabulous curriculum that's now being developed. Self-assessment is hard because it depends on our internal working model, and our internal working model is what we believe about ourselves, other people, and the world at large, and those are based on reflections from our primary caregivers, and then every other caregiver in our life that has a certain thought or feeling about who we are and what they see in our eyes. Optimism has many functions, many underlying mechanisms. I want us to understand that they include biological mechanisms, but also emotional and cognitive. Bruce Perry talks a lot about how states become traits. So what happens over time is we can feel hopeless about a situation or not getting out of it. It is okay day to day. Sometimes I get up and think there's no way today I'm going to be able to accomplish what I'm supposed to. When those become a pattern, when they become a pattern in terms of our neural network, then we develop what's called learned helplessness. Oops. Internal working models are how I mentioned that. Internal working models have an impact on our physiological and emotional regulation. So whether we can feel safe and calm about ourselves and other people in the world, all emerge from those initial attunement relationships with a caregiver that tell us about ourselves. The more distressing emotion is, the harder it is for us to look at. So we engage avoidance when we feel something is distressing. When we have primary caregivers who have distressing trauma and affect in their background, and they see that in their child, because it has been painful and unresolved in their own lives, they tend to avoid and ignore those. And as a result, those young children also learn to avoid and distract when they feel distressed, and certainly don't know how to co-regulate through a relationship. Dan Siegel talks about the gold is in the shadows. And that means that those things that are hard for us, those things about ourselves that drive our behavior through implicit memory, especially with regard to our relationships and how we all feel in relationships, those things that are the hardest to look at probably have the best likelihood of changing our behavior ultimately. First, we have to be able to manage our emotions and thoughts before we can begin to be self-aware. If we think about our amygdala being fired and being upset about things and being distressed, if we cannot manage our emotions by calming ourselves down, then our ability to be self-aware cannot happen because we're, again, unable to engage our prefrontal lobe. Nobody learns to self-regulate all alone. Self-regulation is a relationship process, and it begins with early caregivers. If that doesn't happen with early caregivers, when I'm talking about bio parents, foster parents, fathers, all of those different folks, then it comes to our teachers and our educators and our therapists and our police officers and child protective services and everyone else that's in this together working with traumatized kids. I'm going to move past a couple. All right, mirror neurons. I mentioned earlier that mirror neurons support attunement by allowing us to get a sense of the emotions and intentions of others. So mirror neurons literally are neurons that fire in unison with another person's mirror neurons. They allow us to learn through imitation. We can watch somebody do an act, and we will literally have mirror motor neurons which allow us to practice that act. It allows us to read the intentions behind people's behaviors. For example, without you saying that you're scared of me, I can pick that up through my sense of your nonverbal cues. And most importantly, when we're around other people, because we're humans, because we have mirror neurons, we are susceptible to feeling the emotions of another person. The younger the child and the more traumatized, the more likely we are to be impacted by what their experiences have been, including a sense of hopelessness or helplessness. I love the term emotion contagion. Emotion contagion refers to the upshot is that when we're around other people, when we're around students and educators, we get the opportunity to improve their mood and their emotional status by being mindful of what we're feeling and sharing with them in those times. And the downshot is, if we're around complex trauma, if we feel hopeless about what we're doing, or we're around folks often who feel hopeless, we are going to begin to experience some of those feelings because we're human and because we have mirror neurons. Attunement, these processes of getting cues correctly in an interpersonal relationship, accurately responding to allow us to feel safe. The more time we have these repeated interactions, the stronger that neural path gets. The secure mother at an intuitive, non-conscious level is continually regulating the baby's shifting arousal states and thus emotional state. So literally, when we're around students, when we're around other people, by being aware of what we feel with them, by calming ourselves with them, we begin to shift somebody else's emotional regulation state, what Alan Shore refers to as regulation theory. Attachment and self-regulation are driven by instinctual caring and bonding, which are tied to survival and protection. And I say that because these are very deep-rooted neurobiological systems that we can capitalize on to engage students in relationship such that they can begin to attend to academic tasks. It's supported by a relational reward system. When we're around other people that feel good and feel safe, we feel good because you get a burst of good neurotransmitters, which is a lovely thing. If your experience is that other people have not been safe and that has not been your experience, then when you're in the context of another person, especially a person who may be doubtful or fearful of you, then you have quite the opposite, right? A negative threat-based response to that interaction. So a secure attachment means we can feel safe with others and are able to regulate ourselves. First co-regulation, then self. What if I just don't look at you? Do you have like one of those hooks you'll pull me off? Or and empathy carry a lot of weight. I wish I had a couple of hours to talk about all of those notions with you all today and what underlies them. But maintaining attention is a very complex and initially instinctually driven system. There's two ways to maintain attention. You can do top-down maintenance of attention, which is what we just said. We can think hard enough, reflect enough, bring to bear our mind and what we want to do to calm our amygdala down, to calm ourselves down so that we can focus. But there's also maintaining attention from bottom up, from the feelings and sensations that we have and the request that those are making of us to attend to those. So it's about choice often in our bodies in terms of what we choose. Maintaining attention, which you get down to the root of it, has to do with approach and engagement. So we attend to something that we feel like we can engage with, we're safe with, and we can approach. We don't tend to pay attention to things that we feel unsafe or that we can't engage in. I did that. Last but not least, responsible decision-making. Bruce Perry, again, wrote a white paper that I absolutely love about the 7 stages of development with regard to respect and healthy child development. He talks about the very first thing that we have to develop is the capacity to attach to somebody who's safe, to a primary caregiver before, as I mentioned earlier, you're able to regulate in the context of those relationships. Once you can do that, if you can attach to folks and feel safe, if you can begin then to regulate with a relationship, then there's a connection made, right? Now we can have a sense of connection to other people, and only then can we think about group affiliation, right? If I can then connect with other people, can I expand that? Can I feel safe in a larger group, which is an affiliation? And if I can feel safe enough to do that, maybe then I can attune to other people. And maybe I can have tolerance and respect and empathy for other folks. So, in sum, as Louis Cozzolino and other folks are talking about, and I think it's effective and interesting to dig into, is that what we're faced with now is that we've moved from this tribal society very quickly to an industrialized society, which have core foundations which are very different from what we know about our brain and what we know about how the brain learns in social situations. Ultimately, as Robert Pianta talks about, the teacher is an attachment figure, and we can look at school readiness and attachment and look at the primary explainer of whether a child is going to be able to engage and have school readiness skills is their level of attachment, and that those attachment systems actually translate to teachers bilaterally. They can pass those on, and the teachers can pass back to them. One last quote. The quality of the teacher-child relationship has been found to link directly to children's social-emotional outcomes, behavior, social skills, self-regulation, executive functioning, as well as to moderate the relation between children's disruptive behavior and their later school outcomes. We want teachers who can provide the disconfirming experience when they're faced with students who are putting upon them unintentionally the feeling that they are not worthy. You are worthy and wanted, you're capable, you're safe. I, as an educator and a human, are available and I won't reject you. I'm responsive and I won't threaten you, and I'm safe and will keep you from danger. I think if you talk to teachers these days, and I get to talk with lots of teachers, what we would say is they spend a fabulous job preparing, but you don't get to learn the science and skills of relationships, which I tried to cram into about 45 minutes for you all today, that clearly takes more time for people to engage in. But we know from the psychotherapies, we know from the brain science at this point how to activate brains, how to engage students in learning, and primarily that happens through relationships. But I think we need to be able to prepare educators for that task. What time is it? Okay, I still have a minute. So developing trauma-sensitive schools, I've been putting a lot of thought into this, and I guess part of the question is, what is a social and emotional learning? What are trauma-sensitive schools? What are a multi-tiered system of supports? What is PBIS? And how do those all fit together? And I do think, as the Venn diagram indicates, that there is a beautiful marriage between them. But what I'm hoping to do and talk about this afternoon, and I'm lucky enough to do with schools across the state, is to begin to look at this very special part of the Venn diagram, which is really around trauma-sensitive schools. And what I see from that is what I just said, the opportunity for educators to learn the science of relationships and the skills for relationships. We can certainly give those away as well. And then to look at whole system change around policy that capitalizes on what we know about belonging and tribal learning.
Definitely a lot to cover. So we have some time for some questions. Does anybody have questions for Dr. Yackley? And we have, if you'd like to step up to the microphone, or if you have a loud voice and feel confident you can speak from your seat, go for it.
Yeah. Hi.
I'm Eve Sullivan, founder of Parents Forum, and I was playing a little buzzword bingo, and my buzzword, of course, is parent. And I think it's a word that we avoid using. I got primary caregiver. I did hear mommy. I maybe heard dad somewhere in there. But attachment forms at the beginning with parents. I imagine most people in this room, many people at least, are parents, probably a few grandparents like myself. How do we support parents without blaming them? When you brought up parents, you said, over-parenting or under-parenting. Well, there must be a few in the middle who are doing a fabulous job. I include, of course, my own children.
I have some days that are better than others.
Mixed. Oh, well, definitely. I'd like to know how schools and all the wonderful caring professionals, including mental health professionals, I've benefited from both peer support and professional. How can we better include parents? How can we get them in the door and then give them what they need without making them feel awful?
I love your question. Thank you so much for asking that today. So most of my work and most of my time has been blessed with working, and I use caregivers, and I'll say why I chose that word, but my heart and my passion is working with parents and caregivers and their children who have the rightful place and the important place of healing their children. And I think for far too long what's happened is we as therapists in a system have worked very hard to protect kids and bring them in a room alone and try to fix trauma that has happened. I do not work with children alone ever anymore. I always work with caregivers and a child together, If I'm not working with a child and a caregiver together, then it is with a caregiver alone to support them as in their role and their capacity. You know, what I like about trauma-informed care, and I tried to do it today and maybe didn't do it justice, is that it removes all of that blame. When we understand what happens in terms of fear learning, trauma theory to our brain, and then we understand how attunement and attachment processes are carried out in the context of relationship, for me, there is no blame of an individual. For me, it's we understand as a society what these kinds of exposures and oppressions do, and it's all about giving the power back to the caregivers to be with their kids. And when I work with caregivers, the reason I use that broadly is I work a lot with foster parents, iterations of foster parents, bio parents, grandparents. And so I try to be as inclusive as I can, resource parents in terms of who we're working with. And also, while caregivers are the most important people, we're all important. And so what I think of caregivers is all of us in the human race and the way we treat each other when we know about emotion contagion. I'm not going to get political today, but it's about all caregiving relationships. What do we know about how to engage each other and be safe as humans and to evolve? I've seen caregivers come from the most horrific circumstances, moms and dads, and be good parents. It's the biggest gift of my life.
Anyone else? A question? Yeah, if you do, I see someone's coming up to the microphone, but if you have a question, you can feel free to go up to the microphone as well. And
I want to thank you very much for your talk. It was just incredible. I learned so much.
Thank you.
I have a project where I'm working with 18 to 20-year-old, 22-year-old students who are still in public education. Most of them are ELs. Many come from traumatized backgrounds. And I was wondering what kind of work is being done with this adult age group. One of my reasons for really looking into this group and working with them is because I was the director of programs in Cambridge, and two of our former students, this was in Massachusetts, were part of were the Boston Marathon bombers. And I keep thinking over and over, what could we have done to work with this, as they were basically adults, especially the older one, what could we have done to work with them? And as you've worked with parents, I was just wondering if there was a relationship, because many of these parents, as you described, have also been traumatized, if you have any ideas on what we can do with this age group. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your work. I focus a lot on young children, so that stumped me a little bit when I started to listen to what she was saying. Let me share this, and then I wonder if other people have comments. I think it's a lot easier to look at little kids that have been traumatized and have empathy for them, even if they're kind of awful and they spit on us and do those kind of things. They're little, and there's some neurobiology that pulls us to little kids in ways that are different than it does as we get older. And so I think, epitomized by our thought about caregivers and not blaming caregivers for the, multi-generational trauma they experienced, I think we have to dig a lot deeper with people who work with older kids and young adults and talk about the aggressive stance. So many things I didn't talk about. I think about the aggressive stance for people to understand that when you have core shame and you are ultimately feel vulnerable in the world, that you are going to look bigger and bad enough than anybody around you because you don't want anybody to see what's underneath that surface. So I would want people working with older adults or young adults to understand the aggressive stance and what that means. I often talk about, and I think they'd be represented in your group of transitional age-ish youth. I often talk about this experience if we don't have that opportunity to learn about regulation through a caregiver, if we don't have attachment. So I've described it. I'm going to pick on you a little bit because you're friendly and you smile at me. But the experience would be like this, and I would want people to understand these dynamics, right? But the experience for me would be like, I'm by myself and I feel dysregulated. I don't feel good because I feel worthless. Ultimately, I don't know that, but I feel icky and I don't feel like I'm okay alone. And then I see you and you seem friendly, and so I'm going to approach you. And you're nice, and we start to get engaged, and I get closer. You have good empathy, and the minute I get close to you and it feels great, it's like this: oh my God, you're going to abandon me. Oh my gosh, I'm terrified. I'm terrified in this relationship. I got to get out. I got to get out. I can't do this, right? And then I back up, and then I'm alone again, and now I perceive that I've been rejected, and I still can't regulate. Remember that thing about co-regulation? Got to learn to co-regulate first. So then I get by myself, and I'm really distressed. I might do something like self-harm. Whatever I can do to get away from the emotions that I experience. And then I realize I've got to be drawn to somebody else, so now I'm going to go to you, and I'm going to get close to you, and I'm going to draw into you, and the minute, same thing happens. The minute I get close, I got to get out of there. I'm terrified about what you're going to do. What do we call that? Somebody know what that is? I know some of my friends do in the room. What's that called? $1 million question. I don't have $1 million. Borderline personality disorder. I invite us to call that adult attachment disorder. We got it wrong, right? It's used pejoratively. It refers to those people who have had the most trauma in our society, 99.9% of those individuals. And instead of recognizing what it is, an ultimate failure in adult relationships throughout their lifetime, which we inadvertently play out all the time, then they end up in a position where they're an adult, and now we think of them as a personality disorder. Remember I said earlier, how states become traits? Same notion, right? If my response in an interpersonal relationship is a pattern of trying to seek closeness and be regulated and terrified by abandonment, and I keep doing that, sure, we can call that a personality disorder. Doesn't mean it doesn't change, but I have to have enough experiences in relationships with people who don't do that same thing. Go ahead. Let me say one little thing. I just want to say one little child example, and then I'll move to your question. Thank you. So I want to just walk through this little kid example for a second. Okay, so pretend that I am 6 months old and my mom is in a domestically violent relationship. And maybe I'm in the room, maybe I'm not at that time, but I'm only 6 months old. And let's say mom gets out, she gets social supports, and mom gets out of that relationship when I'm, I don't know, let's say 1.5 years of age. Okay, and mom, according to mom, I wasn't a part of any of it. I was too young, right? What happens is I start to grow up and I'm pretty dysregulated, and I have an overactive fear brain that responds to fear very quickly. Every quarter second I'm saying, yes, I am in danger. In fact, this is not a good situation. And as a result of that, what happens is I kind of want to hurt cats. I kind of want to pull their tail and I want to kick them sometimes. I don't really understand that, but I feel angry and I need to do something with that. And then what happens, not blaming anybody at all, mom looks at me, somebody else looks at me and says, you're just like your dad. You're bipolar. You're going to have to jail just like your dad, right? Not mom's fault. Nobody's bad fault, right? But that's the experience. Even if mom doesn't say it out loud, she's going to be terrified if no one's had an opportunity to help her through this process. So then, let's call him little Johnny. So then little Johnny gets ready for preschool. We have really good intentions. We're going to have a meeting before school starts, right? We're going to talk about little Johnny and what he does when he gets mad. It's a great meeting. Explicit memory-wise, we come up with a great behavioral plan. Implicitly, more in research looking at this, implicitly, when we even think about Johnny, we feel a little bit afraid, right? Because we're worried about what's going to happen when he comes in our room. Nobody's fault, part of human contagion. Then he comes in the room and he gets that look on his face, right? Like, oh no. And the teacher looks at him like, oh no, this is going to be it. And this is what Johnny says, she's scared of me too. Mom was scared of me. I do want to hurt people. She's afraid of me, right? Let's play that out for 10, 15 years, right? Now they're your folks in your program who have seen this confirming experience of what their character is like. Unless we can convince the world, you're all going to help me do this, we need to convince the world that we can be disconfirming experiences in the world and that we can change that automatic response. But we've got to have some tenacity and we've got to have some persistence, because the reality is the older you get, the harder it is. It's always possible. Okay, I'm sorry I had to say that little snippet. Your turn.
I think you may have answered it.
Oh, wow.
You may have answered it in your last remark. Given that we have schools where there are concentrations of youngsters about which you are speaking, and individuals who have the responsibility to help them be successful. What do you perceive, or what message would you give to schools around how they can best reconfigure themselves to be more responsive to this population that they can't escape, particularly given the time that you said, that you indicate, and the persistence that might be generation after generation as opposed to just the episodic events associated with an individual?
Absolutely. We can't just add another new initiative, right? I just feel like people are just swimming right now with new initiatives and new ideas. And when I look at people and ask them to do something new, I just think they're just done, right? Everybody's already overwhelmed by things. And I'm just a little psychologist, so I don't know that I have any political power in the world, but I think we need to talk about a shift in focus. And I'm not the ones that are going to able to make that shift in focus, but I do know folks, I know administrators, and I know educators who can begin to make that shift in focus. And I think some of it is going to be, I know some of it is going to be talking about things that are really uncomfortable. Because I want to talk to that little Johnny, right? I want to tell Johnny. I don't want to tell him gory details, but I want him to understand that scary things happened when he was little, and that if scary things happen when you're little, sometimes you might feel like you want to hurt people. I want to talk about ACEs in the classroom. I want everybody to benefit from what we know about the brain and traumatic exposure. And that is really uncomfortable given we know 70% of our educators likely have a trauma background as well. So I don't know if this is my best answer. I think maybe you do a better job after hearing you. But I think what a lot of folks are saying, and I would agree, is that we're going to have to shift priorities and focus. And the first part of that focus has to be relationships and safety and brain understanding. The next half part has to be scaffolding of skills. And I would begin with support for teachers. I wouldn't begin with supports for kids. I think we have to start with teachers. We have to give them what they need. We have to build safe climates and environments for teachers. We have to show them that we understand what they're facing. We have to tell them that we get it, that it feels helpless, and sometimes they feel like they're not a good teacher, but it's not their fault. They haven't been given all the information. If a kid has a meltdown in the room, we have to be able to talk in the whole room about how we handle his emotions in our room and how we feel safe. If somebody goes to the hospital, the psychiatric hospital, we actually have to talk about it when they come back. So some of it is what they say. We're going to have to start speaking the unspeakable, and we're going to have to show what's important to us in our world. And what's important is social engagement. And when we do social engagement, we'll get all those other things to follow. But we're going to have to convince folks to shift the focus. And that seems hard, I know. But there's a wave of us at this point. I know thousands now of us that would do that. Did that answer? Yeah.
I just want to piggyback on that. I think not only do we need to educate teachers and give them the support. You stand at the mic.
I hate them too.
Just to piggyback on that, not only do we need to educate and give them the support, but we also need them to allow them to make the engagement, because I think the problem with the system is we tell them the relationship is important, but with everything else, they implicitly know that the relationship is important.
Some do, some don't.
Many of them do,
Many do.
yes. But they can't do that, which then stresses them. So they have, many of them, have this knowledge and implicit, drive, but they can't get to the relationship because of the system and what the system has them reeling and doing.
Yeah, absolutely right. So I talk a lot with groups. One of my specialties is reflective practice, and I've been training mental health clinicians, including doctoral interns, for about a decade in reflective practice. Little different from mindfulness, but I think you gave me a nice segue to build on. Part of this is this, the science of relationships and all of what we've been talking about today, and the skills. How do you do that? How do we give away counseling skills, if you will, to do that? But the way we deal with implicit memory is through reflective process, right? So unless we value and we build in spaces of non-judgmental reflective space to say, I was really mad at this kid and I want to kick him in the shin today, right? unless we have safe places that teachers can say, I have these thoughts and feelings, doesn't mean I'm a bad person, but I'm having these, then nobody's going to tell us what's really going on in terms of their feelings. They'll just remain feeling hopeless or helpless and then burned out and not want to do it. So I often talk about how we get something from implicit memory to explicit memory. So let me just give a quick example of that so that we can all wrap our minds around it. Let's say that, I'll do my cupboard example. Let's just say that, for example, you're in a relationship with somebody you care a lot about, right? And maybe their habit is that they can't shut cupboards ever shut a cupboard in their life, right? And let's say that you're really anal and tidy as an individual and you would like everything to be closed and neat, just as so. So let's say this person you love very much, every time you come in the room and the cupboards are open, you are infuriated because you've made it very clear how you feel about open cupboards and a tidy house, right? So then years go by, right? You still come in the room. When you come in the room, you get this feeling in your gut that's like an ugh, right? This frustration, icky feeling in your gut. But you realize after 10, 15 years that maybe the cupboard shutting is never going to change, right? So what you do is you begin to say, I'm going to come into that room at this point in time. I'm going to experience what this visceral response is, frustration, you don't care, all of those kinds of things. And I'm going to say, I'm going to choose not to react in that way. We've been around this a million times. I'm going to let it go. It's not important in the scheme of the world. And lo and behold, I can calm down. Because what I've done is I've taken something, a reaction, an interpersonal, explicit reaction that bothers me. I've dealt with it enough by thinking of it enough that I can have enough power over my frustration gut to calm and control what I do with that. So in many ways, the processes we're talking about for teachers are these opportunities for students, parallel process for us, for teachers, for students, for parents, caregivers, whoever, to be safe enough and to have the downtime and to value thinking about our reactions. Because if we don't have a space to think about our reactions, they will continue to drive 99% of the time teacher bias, negative expectations, et cetera, right? So I think we have to talk about those things with students.